Hello there. In the following video I'm going to be making a lamellar helmet. This is my first attempt at making one of these, and I'm not a terribly skilled armorsmith in any case, so this video should not be taken as a how-to, so much as just general observations and a couple of tips and things you should avoid. Before starting, I made several cardboard mock-ups to decide the dimensions of each piece. Unfortunately, I didn't think to take pictures of the mock-ups before I threw them out. Oh well. The steel I'm using is very thin, 20 gauge or maybe even less. The reason I'm using such thin steel is that because of the overlap, the helmet will essentially be twice as thick as it ought to be. Twice as thick means twice as heavy. The tin snips cause the piece to warp and bend a little bit, so I'm just flattening it out here. Now I'm just removing the sharp edges with the belt sander. Tongs make everything more awkward, so if I can hold the piece safely with my bare hands, I prefer to. What you want to do here is just rock it back and forth so that it never has the chance to stay in one spot for too long. If you hold it too still, you'll just end up grinding new edges onto the piece. This isn't strictly necessary for the finished product to be functional, but it does make everything a lot nicer. This first piece will serve as a template for all the others. This ensures that they're all more or less identical. Most of the reproductions you see on the internet of lamellar helmets like this feature fancy scalloped edges along each of the pieces. I decided not to bother with that, seeing as I don't really know what I'm doing. Scalloped edges are mostly there just for decoration, but also to reduce the weight by a little bit. My design requires 28 of these side pieces, plus 2 different ones for the front and the back. One benefit to using very thin steel is that I can cut it with just a pair of tin snips. If this were a thicker piece of steel, I would need to heat it up and use chisels to cut it, or else make a mess of it with an angle grinder. Even with things as they are, this step took forever. The sheet metal I'm using has got this ugly white paint on it. This is unfortunate, but it's what I had lying around, so may as well make use of it. If I had the patience, I could take off all the paint with a wire brush. But as I didn't even know if this would work out or not, I figured it was more effort than it was worth. At the bottom of each piece, the 2 edges are parallel for about 3 inches before the taper begins. The reason for this is that if the whole piece tapers, what you'll end up with is a cone. As most of us don't have cone-shaped heads, this really won't do for a helmet. Well, I reckon you've seen enough of this. Let's move on to something more interesting, like flattening. Fascinating stuff, this. Alright, that's enough of that. Back to the grinder to take off all the rough edges. Yet another fascinating step. Now we finally get to the actual shaping of the piece. What I'm doing here is I'm using the top of the swage block to slightly dish the piece. I want the finished helmet to be round rather than 30-sided. Conveniently, this also causes the piece to curve in the other dimension as well, saving me a bit of effort. Now I'm going to bend the piece with my hands. This takes a bit more effort, but I get a bit more control when I'm doing this. The piece is a little bit too curved, so I'm flattening it out just a little bit. I'm also bending the very tip in the other direction, into the desired shape. Now a few taps of the hammer, just to even out the curves of the tip. Remembering that I have an audience. Alright, that's 1 down, 29 to go. I'm using the first piece as a pattern just to make sure that they have roughly the same degree of curvature. By bending the new piece on top of the pattern, I make sure that the bend is in exactly the same spot. I just have to be careful not to mess up the pattern. pieces are not symmetrical. One edge of the piece is flat, the other edge has two bevels. In order for my design to work, I need to make 14 pieces where the bevel faces to the right and 14 pieces where the bevel faces to the left. The swage block is one of the unsung heroes of metalworking. It just makes everything so much easier. I want each of the pieces to roughly curve to the shape of my head, the exception being the tip and the base of the piece. The base of the piece needs to be straight for about 3 inches or so. If the base shares the same level of curvature as the rest of the piece, the brim of the helmet when it's finished will cut into the sides of your head as you wear it, which is not so good. I don't really have too much more to say about this step, so I'm just going to let the footage play out. Now that the pieces are made, time to drill the holes. For the first piece, I'm just eyeballing the holes. They don't need to be perfect, they just have to match the other pieces. For every subsequent piece, I used the first piece as a pattern, holding them together and sticking a marker through the holes. I'm drilling on top of a piece of scrap wood. I don't need to do this, but I find that the drill bit will bend the metal around the holes in the table. Drilling against something solid like a piece of wood prevents the metal from being deformed too much. In retrospect, if I were to do this again, I would probably drill the holes before shaping it. Because of all the hammer marks and the curvature of the piece, the drill bit likes to slip around, meaning that some of the holes don't line up properly. Now back to the grinder. There are little burrs of metal all around the holes that I drilled, so I just want to take those off, otherwise they'll cut the cords as I try to sew it together. Now all the pieces are made, time to sew it together. I had more frustration with this part than with all the other parts put together. The pieces won't sit still as you try and sew them together, and if you pull the cords too tightly they'll get cut on the edges. I'm using fake sinew to sew it together. No reason for this, it's just what I had to hand. I don't know what this style of stitching is called, but it's fairly ubiquitous for lamellar armors. On the outside of the armor you stitch vertically, on the inside you stitch diagonally. Once you reach the end of a row, you turn around and stitch in the other direction. On the finished product, the stitching on the inside should look like a lot of little X's lined up. I was having a lot of trouble with the piece as it got longer, so I decided to stitch it together in sections rather than all in one piece. It just makes it a little bit easier to hold. Trying to record this doesn't make it any easier. Trying to keep it in frame while keeping my head out of the frame, well, it makes it a bit more of a hassle. I didn't record the entirety of sewing it together, it was just too aggravating for me. So when the batteries died I didn't bother replacing them. Oh well, you can imagine the rest. So here's the helmet all sewn together. That paint looks really, really bad. I wish there was an easy way to remove paint short of burning it off and poisoning my lungs. Oh well. The helmet doesn't fit quite right, so I'm just adjusting it. I put a little bit too much curvature near the bottom of the piece, so the edges cut into the sides of my head. So I'm just using a piece of railroad track to flare the edges out slightly. I accidentally cut some of the cords while I was doing this, but that doesn't matter too much, it just means a little bit more sewing later. Now adjusting the top to make sure that they all line up properly. Now I'm going to make the cap for the helmet. To do this, I'm just working a piece of metal over the hole in the swage block. I think this footage is fascinating, so I'm just going to let it speak for itself. The more I work the metal, the thinner it gets. And as this is quite thin steel to begin with, I have to be very careful of tearing holes in it if I hit it too hard or too much. Now I got it shaped, time to cut it out. I'm not going to be able to cut it out perfectly. Close counts. I'm just filling out the edges, adjusting the size ever so slightly, making it a little bit more round. The usual. Now sanding off all the rough edges left by the snips. After this comes more drilling of holes, more sewing, and a paint job, none of which I filmed. And here we have the finished product. It isn't the masterpiece I was hoping for, but it's not too bad. It functions. Who can ask for more than that? I think it goes with my existing armor reasonably well. Well, that's all I have to say about that. I hope you enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making this. Bye-bye.